What if the person you trusted most with your life was actually taking it? For over 2 decades, patients in Manchester, England, placed their complete faith in a respected family doctor named Harold Shipman. They saw him as a caring physician who would make house calls, comfort the dying, and ease their final moments. They had no idea he was actually causing those final moments. Harold Frederick Shipman is officially recognized as one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history, with 218 confirmed murders and possibly as many as 459 total victims. But what makes his case truly chilling isn't just the numbers, it's how he used his position as a trusted medical professional to kill with impunity for over 20 years. Today, we're examining the case that shook the British medical establishment to its core and changed how we think about medical murder. Harold Frederick Shipman was born on January 14, 1946, in Nottingham, England, to working-class parents Harold and Vera Shipman. From the outside, his childhood appeared unremarkable, though those who knew him described young Harold as arrogant and somewhat of a loner. The defining moment of Shipman's early life came when he was 17 years old. His mother, Vera, was dying of lung cancer, and Harold would rush home from school each day to care for her. He watched as the family doctor administered morphine injections to ease her pain, and he noticed how these injections seemed to give her relief and eventually peaceful sleep. Vera died in 1963, but that image of morphine as both healer and potential deliverer stayed with Harold. Despite average academic performance, Shipman was accepted to Leeds University Medical School in 1965. His classmates remember him as confident to the point of arrogance, often acting as if he knew better than his professors. This superiority complex would become a defining characteristic throughout his career. He graduated in 1970 and married Primrose Oxtoby, a fellow student. They would go on to have 4 children together, and by all outward appearances, they seemed like a normal middle-class family. Shipman's first position was as a junior doctor at Pontefract General Infirmary in Yorkshire. Colleagues noticed he was confident, sometimes overly so, but he seemed competent enough. However, cracks in his facade were already beginning to show. In 1975, while working at a practice in Todmorden, West Yorkshire, Shipman's career nearly ended before his killing spree began. Partners at the practice became suspicious when they noticed discrepancies in their drug supplies. Specifically, large amounts of morphine and other controlled substances were going missing. An investigation revealed that Shipman had been forging prescriptions and injecting himself with morphine. He had developed a serious addiction, likely stemming from his access to medical supplies and possibly connected to his traumatic experience watching his mother die. When confronted, Shipman admitted to the addiction and entered a drug rehabilitation program. The General Medical Council allowed him to continue practicing after treatment, a decision that would prove catastrophic. This early brush with drug abuse should have been a red flag, but the medical establishment's tendency to protect its own meant Shipman received a second chance. What's particularly chilling is that during this period in Todmorden, there were already unexplained deaths among his patients, though these wouldn't be investigated until decades later. In 1977, Shipman joined a group practice in Hyde, Greater Manchester. This move would mark the beginning of his systematic killing spree, though it would be years before anyone suspected the trusted family doctor of murder. Shipman quickly built a reputation as a dedicated physician who would make house calls at any hour. Patients loved him because he seemed genuinely caring and was always available in emergencies. What they didn't know was that he was creating many of those emergencies himself. His method was deceptively simple. Shipman would visit elderly patients, often alone in their homes, and administer what he claimed were necessary injections, vitamins, painkillers, or other treatments. In reality, these injections contained lethal doses of morphine or other drugs. The victims would die within minutes, and Shipman would comfort the family, explaining that their loved one had suffered a sudden heart attack, stroke, or other medical emergency. As a respected doctor, his word was rarely questioned. One of his earliest confirmed victims was Eva Lyons, a 70-year-old woman who died in March 1975, though this wouldn't be proven until years later. The pattern was consistent. Shipman would arrive at a patient's home, often unexpectedly, administer an injection, and within minutes the patient would be dead. What made Shipman particularly dangerous was his ability to manipulate the situation entirely. He would often be the one to discover the body, call the authorities, comfort the family, and even help arrange the funeral. He inserted himself into every aspect of the death, giving him complete control over the narrative. Between 1977 and 1993, while working at the Hyde practice, Shipman's killing accelerated. Colleagues occasionally noticed that he seemed to have an unusually high number of patient deaths, but in a profession where death is common, especially among elderly patients, these concerns were easily dismissed. In 1992, Shipman made a decision that would give him even more freedom to kill. He left the group practice and opened his own single-handed practice in Hyde. Now, with no partners to question his methods or monitor his patient death rates, Shipman's killing spree escalated dramatically. Running his own practice meant Shipman had complete autonomy. He could forge medical records, issue death certificates without oversight, and make house calls without anyone knowing his whereabouts. The isolation of single-handed practice, meant to give doctors more flexibility, became the perfect cover for murder. His patient list grew to over 3,000 people, many of whom were elderly residents of Hyde and the surrounding areas. Shipman cultivated an image as the ideal family doctor, caring, available, and willing to make house calls that other doctors had largely abandoned. But behind this facade, he was killing with increasing frequency. Some weeks saw multiple deaths among his patients, all attributed to natural causes. The families trusted Shipman completely, often thanking him for being with their loved ones in their final moments. Shipman had also developed a psychological need for control and power over life and death. Former colleagues would later describe how he seemed to enjoy being the bearer of bad news and appeared unusually comfortable discussing death and dying. During this period, Shipman killed some of his most vulnerable victims. Many were elderly women living alone who had grown to trust and depend on their caring doctor. Others were patients with chronic conditions who relied on Shipman for regular care. The sheer audacity of his crimes during this period is staggering. He would sometimes kill patients just hours after they had visited his office for routine appointments, claiming they had suddenly taken a turn for the worse. The beginning of the end for Harold Shipman came from an unexpected source, a local funeral director named Alan Massey. By the mid-1990s, Massey had begun to notice a disturbing pattern. Massey's funeral home was handling an unusually high number of deaths from Shipman's practice. Even more concerning, many of these patients seemed to have died suddenly and unexpectedly, often while Shipman was present or shortly after his visits. What really caught Massey's attention was the condition of the bodies. Unlike typical deaths from heart attacks or strokes, these patients looked peaceful, almost as if they had simply fallen asleep. This was consistent with morphine poisoning, though Massey didn't immediately make that connection. In March 1998, Massey finally contacted the local coroner, John Pollard, about his concerns. Pollard was initially skeptical. After all, Shipman was a respected doctor with over 20 years of experience, but the funeral director's concerns were detailed and persistent. The case that finally triggered a formal investigation was the death of Kathleen Grundy, an 81-year-old former mayoress of Hyde. Grundy was healthy and active for her age, regularly participating in community activities. On June 24, 1998, Shipman visited her home for what he claimed was a routine blood test. Hours later, Grundy was found dead in her home. Shipman quickly arrived on the scene and pronounced her dead, attributing the death to old age. But Grundy's daughter, Angela Woodruff, was a solicitor, and she immediately noticed several suspicious circumstances. First, Shipman had been unusually quick to contact the coroner and arrange for cremation. Second, a will had suddenly appeared, allegedly signed by Grundy just days before her death, leaving her entire £386,000 estate to Shipman. The will was clearly a forgery. It was typed on an old typewriter and contained several spelling errors that the well-educated Grundy would never have made. Woodruff contacted the police, and Detective Inspector Stan Egerton began what would become one of Britain's largest criminal investigations. When police began investigating Shipman in August 1998, they initially expected to find evidence of fraud related to Kathleen Grundy's forged will. What they discovered was far more horrifying. Detective Inspector Stan Egerton and his team started by examining the circumstances of Grundy's death. When they ordered an exhumation and autopsy, they found lethal levels of morphine in her system, enough to kill her several times over. But this was just the beginning. As police expanded their investigation, a terrifying pattern emerged. They began examining other recent deaths among Shipman's patients and found case after case of suspicious circumstances. The investigation team, led by Detective Chief Inspector Mike Williams, eventually examined over 800 deaths. They found that Shipman's patient death rate was significantly higher than other local doctors. In some years, his patients were dying at nearly twice the expected rate. More damning evidence came from Shipman's own medical records. Investigators found that he had been stockpiling morphine and other controlled substances far beyond what would be needed for legitimate medical practice. Computer records showed he had been accessing and altering patient files after their deaths, apparently trying to create medical histories that would justify sudden deaths. Perhaps most chilling of all, investigators discovered that Shipman had been forging medical records on a massive scale. He would create false entries suggesting that patients were sicker than they actually were, providing post hoc justification for their unexpected deaths. The scope of the investigation grew rapidly. Police were now looking at deaths going back over 20 years, and the potential victim count was staggering. Harold Shipman's trial began on October 5, 1999, at Preston Crown Court. The prosecution, led by Richard Henriques QC, faced the challenging task of proving that a respected doctor had systematically murdered his patients over more than 2 decades. The trial focused on 15 specific murders, chosen because they had the strongest evidence, plus 1 count of forging Kathleen Grundy's will. But everyone in the courtroom knew these 15 cases represented just the tip of the iceberg. Throughout the trial, Shipman maintained his innocence with the same arrogance that had characterized his entire career. He claimed he was being persecuted and that the deaths were all from natural causes. His defense argued that as a caring doctor, he had simply been unlucky to have so many patients die while under his care. But the evidence was overwhelming. Forensic experts testified about the morphine found in victims' bodies. Computer experts showed how Shipman had altered medical records after deaths. Witnesses described how healthy patients had suddenly died during or shortly after Shipman's visits. Perhaps most damaging was the testimony from victims' families. One after another, they described how Shipman had been present when their loved ones died, how he had been quick to pronounce death and arrange cremation, and how he had seemed unusually comfortable with the deaths. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who had become addicted not just to morphine, but to the power of deciding who lived and who died. Shipman had played God with his patients' lives, using his position of trust to commit murder on an industrial scale. On January 31, 2000, after deliberating for 6 days, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Shipman was sentenced to life imprisonment on 15 counts of murder, with the judge recommending he never be released. The Shipman case sent shockwaves through British society and the international medical community. A public inquiry led by Dame Janet Smith eventually concluded that Shipman had killed 218 patients and possibly as many as 459, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded history. The case led to fundamental changes in British medical practice. Death certification procedures were overhauled, controlled drug monitoring was strengthened, and single-handed medical practices faced new oversight requirements. On January 13, 2004, one day before his 58th birthday, Harold Shipman was found dead in his prison cell at Wakefield Prison. He had hanged himself with bedsheets, taking the full extent of his crimes to the grave. The Shipman case remains a stark reminder of how positions of trust can be abused and how the very qualities we value in healthcare providers, access, autonomy, and authority, can be weaponized by those with malicious intent.